A rusted road, a forgotten name, and a moment that should have meant nothing until it meant everything. When a man stopped for what he thought was a stray, he had no idea he was about to reopen a story death itself couldn't finish. If you believe in second chances, stay through the final minute, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from below. The late afternoon sun bled through the haze over an empty stretch of Alabama back road where red dust hung in the air like old memory. Behind the wheel of a faded blue pickup was Langston Meyer, a black man in his early 40s with a weary look and calloused hands that told more stories than he ever would. His shoulders carried the weight of too many unfinished roads jobs that dried up people who didn't stay, and one promise he never forgave himself for breaking. The radio crackled softly with old gospel static, the kind his mother used to hum when life got hard. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular. He just needed motion. Stillness felt too much like remembering. The world around him was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the rhythmic clack of a loose chain in the back. Then something flickered in his mirror, a small blur chasing through the dust cloud his truck kicked up. At first he thought it was a tumbleweed, or maybe a bird caught low, but the shape didn't fade. It ran, fast, determined. It was a puppy. Langston frowned, squinting against the sun. The poor thing was covered in mud, thin enough for ribs to show through its fur. It chased the truck like its life depended on it. He cursed under his breath and pressed the gas a little harder. The dog stumbled but kept going, its paws kicking up pebbles, its tongue out, as if it refused to give up. Langston muttered, "You don't know when to quit, do you?" and looked away, trying to ignore the tug inside him. He had learned a long time ago that pity made things messy. You help once you get pulled in, and he had spent too many years crawling out of other people's messes. But the reflection in his side mirror wouldn't let him forget. That speck of movement behind him grew smaller, slower, and then it fell. Langston's foot hesitated on the gas pedal. He gripped the steering wheel jaw tight. "Not my problem," he said out loud, though no one could hear him. Yet, something about the way the dog had run like it was chasing not just him, but the memory of someone who used to stop, got under his skin. He slammed the brakes. Dust billowed forward in a thick orange cloud, swallowing the front of the truck. When it settled, he saw the little creature lying on the side of the road, chest heaving. Langston opened the door and stepped out, the boots sinking into warm gravel. The heat pressed down like a punishment. The puppy looked up weakly, trembling, its eyes wide and wet. Langston crouched. "Hey there," he said softly, though his voice came out rough from disuse. The pup didn't bark or back away. Instead, it inched forward, dragging one paw, then another, till it reached his foot. It pressed its head against his boot and whimpered a sound so small it could have come from a broken heart. Langston sighed, shaking his head. "You got no sense, do you?" He bent down and saw the faint mark of an old collar around its neck, a ring of rubbed skin, half healed, half remembered. No tag, no rope, just that single sign it had once belonged to someone who stopped caring. He looked up and scanned the tree line, expecting to see a kid or an old truck parked somewhere. Nothing. Just the buzz of cicadas and the smell of hot asphalt. "Where's your people?" he asked. The dog blinked but said nothing, of course. "Yeah, figures." Langston straightened, looked back at his truck, then down at the puppy. "I ain't taking you," he warned. "I don't even got food for myself." The pup tilted its head tail, wagging weakly, as if mocking the lie. "Damn it," Langston muttered and rubbed his face. It had been years since anyone looked at him with that kind of faith. Not since his sister's little boy before the accident. That memory hit hard, and fast sirens, rain, and guilt that didn't wash away. He crouched again and reached out a hand. The puppy hesitated, then licked his fingers. Langston felt something in his chest loosen just a bit. "All right," he said finally, "but just till we find your folks." He scooped the animal up, and it weighed next to nothing, lighter than he expected, warmer than he wanted. It smelled like dirt and rain like something that had survived too much. He opened the truck door, set the pup on the passenger seat, and it immediately curled up, eyes half closing in relief. Langston climbed back behind the wheel, stared out at the empty road, and shook his head. "You better not pee in my truck." The puppy gave a soft sigh, a small exhale that sounded too much like gratitude. As the engine rumbled back to life, Langston couldn't help but glance over. The little thing was already asleep, chest rising and falling slow and even, as if it had finally reached where it was meant to stop. "Ain't got a name, huh?" Langston said quietly. "Guess we'll figure that out later." The next morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of dawn that feels like it's carrying someone else's sorrow. Langston Meyer hadn't slept much. The little dog had curled into a tight ball on an old shirt beside his boots, whimpering in its sleep. Every time Langston's eyes closed, he heard that faint cry again echoing through his dreams like something left unfinished. He told himself it was just one night, just until he could find whoever owned it. But as he poured coffee into a cracked mug, the dog lifted its head and stared at him with such trust that his excuses started to sound like lies. "You're trouble, that's what you are," Langston said, but his tone was soft. He crouched and brushed the matted fur behind its ears, noticing again the faint indentation around its neck. He reached for a knife and carefully cut away what was left of the collar, a filthy strip of fabric hanging by threads. Underneath the grime, a small piece of metal glinted faintly. He wiped it clean with the edge of his sleeve. There were only 2 words scratched in by hand: "Wait here." Langston stared at them for a long time, feeling something hollow press behind his ribs. "Wait here," he whispered, as if testing how it sounded after all this time. He turned the tag over again and again, but there was no name, no address, nothing that could lead him anywhere. Just that phrase, lonely as a promise never kept. The dog, he still hadn't decided on a name, watched him quietly, tail thumping weakly. "So that's what you were doing out there," Langston murmured, "waiting on someone who ain't coming back." He set the tag on the table and rubbed his temples. He'd seen it before, dogs waiting by train stations, porches, highways, waiting until hunger or hope gave out. Maybe people weren't all that different. The memory of his father flashed through his mind, standing on a similar road one summer morning, saying he'd be right back, and then never was. Langston swallowed the bitterness, the taste of years that never left his tongue. He finished his coffee, put on his boots, and decided he'd at least try to see if anyone nearby was missing a pup. The dog followed every move, shadowing him, like it had already made its choice. "You ain't gotta come," he said, reaching for his keys. But when he opened the door, the animal trotted right past him and sat by the truck. Langston couldn't help but laugh, once low and defeated. "You got nerve, I'll give you that." He picked up the tag, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet earth from last night's rain. His truck sat in the yard, dented its blue paint, faded to memory. He opened the passenger door, looked down at the puppy, and said, "Last chance to change your mind." The dog turned its head toward the long dirt road stretching out behind them, ears twitching as if listening for someone. Then it looked back at him, eyes steady. Without hesitation, it jumped into the seat. Langston stood still, the moment settling heavier than he expected. That tiny decision, the kind that felt like nothing pressed against something deep in him. He shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, mumbling, "Guess that's settled." The engine coughed awake. As he drove down the narrow road, the dog sat upright, watching through the window, occasionally glancing back at the empty stretch they'd come from. Langston kept his eyes forward, but he felt the weight of that glance each time, like a ghost in the passenger seat. The sun broke through the clouds, painting the red clay fields gold. For miles, there was no sign of another soul. He stopped at the old feed store near the crossroads and asked around. The clerk shook his head. "Ain't no one around here lost a dog, far as I heard. Looks like a wanderer to me." Langston nodded, though it wasn't the answer he wanted. He drove another hour, checked 2 small farms, even stopped by the gas station where folks pin missing posters. Nothing. Just the hum of the pump and the quiet understanding that this dog hadn't been lost, it had been left. On the way back, Langston glanced at it again. "So what now?" he muttered. The puppy rested its head on the armrest, eyes half closed, trusting him completely. That look made Langston uneasy. He wasn't used to being trusted. He wasn't sure he deserved it. But there it was, anyway, solid and warm beside him, breathing slow, as if the world wasn't cruel enough to matter. He took a deep breath and whispered, "You really think I'm your ride home, huh?" The dog's tail wagged once slow and certain. Langston chuckled under his breath. "Fine," he said, "you win." He reached out a hand and let the small creature press its nose into his palm. The skin there was rough, scarred from years of work and life's missteps, but it was steady. The next day broke warmer, heavy with the scent of pine sap and river air drifting through Langston's open window. He had planned to take the dog, whom he now half-jokingly called Hollow, to the town's rescue shelter that morning, but when he opened the door, the little creature darted out before he could even grab his keys. Langston cursed under his breath and jogged after it, his boots thudding against the damp dirt. The dog didn't run randomly. It moved with purpose, pausing every few yards to look back as if checking whether he was following. "You better know where you're going," he called, but there was a faint smile under his words. Hollow led him past the edge of the property across the back field and into the woods behind it. The morning light filtered through tall loblolly pines, thin beams slicing through the mist, like old memories trying to reach daylight. Langston hadn't been this far back in years. The forest floor was thick with needles and old branches, and the air grew cooler the deeper they went. "You got a nose for trouble," he muttered, stepping over a fallen log. Hollow barked once, then sprinted ahead again, tail straight like a compass needle pointing towards something unseen. When Langston finally caught up, he saw it an old shack sitting crooked among the trees, its boards gray and warped with age, its roof caved in on one side. The place looked forgotten by time itself. Hollow stood in front of the door, whining softly. "What the hell is this?" Langston whispered. He pushed open the door, and the hinges screamed like they hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Light fell through the broken slats, revealing a narrow cot, a rusted lantern, and a metal bowl turned upside down in the corner. Langston stepped inside carefully. It was small enough that his shadow filled half the space. The walls were covered with faint scratches, not from animals, but from nails dragging down wood. Something about the place made him uneasy, like walking into someone else's ghost. Hollow sniffed around, tail low, and then nudged something under the cot. Langston crouched and pulled out a small photograph sealed in a cracked plastic frame. The edges were warped from water damage, but the image was still visible, a young woman with curly hair smiling as she held a little black puppy against her chest. Hollow whined again, pressing close to Langston's leg. "That you," he murmured. On the back of the photo in smudged ink, someone had written, "Back soon." Langston's throat tightened. He turned the photo over again, staring at the dog's face in the picture so full of joy and belonging. He set it down gently on the cot, then ran a hand through his hair. "So you were waiting for her," he said softly. "Waiting where she left you." Hollow sat near the door, looking out toward the forest tail, still now, as if listening for the footsteps that never came back. Langston exhaled slowly, that familiar ache crawling up from his chest again. It wasn't pity anymore. It was recognition. He knew what it meant to wait for someone who didn't return. He'd done it as a boy on his porch, watching the same dirt road until sunset. That same silence filled the shack now. He glanced around the room again, something catching his eye near the back wall. The floorboards there were darker, warped, like they'd been burned. He knelt down and brushed away the dust. Beneath his hand, small shards of glass sparkled faintly in the light. He frowned, prying up one loose plank. Underneath was a shallow cavity filled with soot and ash. He picked up one of the glass pieces. It was smooth, on one side melted on the other. Tire marks cut through the dirt outside the window, black and uneven, like someone had slammed on their brakes right before vanishing into the trees. Jesus, Langston muttered. The picture, the tag, the burned floor, they all lined up into a story that didn't need words. Whoever had been here hadn't left by choice. He put the plank back carefully, then stood and looked down at Hollow, who stared back at him with an almost human sadness. "Ain't no one coming back for you, little one," he said quietly. Hollow tilted its head, as if the words were familiar. Langston glanced once more at the photo on the cot, then picked it up and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "But I guess you still got me." Outside, the sunlight had shifted brighter now, scattering gold across the moss. Langston took one last look at the shack, committing every detail to memory: the warped doorway, the smell of smoke, the silence that felt too heavy for such a small place. He knew he couldn't leave it behind like nothing happened. Not now, not after seeing that picture. As they stepped out, Hollow paused on the threshold, turned back once, and let out a low sound, part bark, part sigh. Langston waited until it came running again, then whistled softly. They walked the long trail home, and though the world around them was the same, something in the air had shifted. Langston didn't realize it yet, but that shack had given him more than clues. It had given him a reason to care again, to look backward without drowning. That evening, as dusk settled over the Alabama pines, Langston sat on the porch, the photo from the shack laid flat in his palm. The face of the woman, the softness in her eyes, haunted him more than he wanted to admit. Hollow rested by his boot head, heavy tail twitching each time the wind stirred. It wasn't just a dog anymore. It was a living reminder of someone who had loved deeply and been torn away without goodbye. Langston had seen the marks in the dirt behind the shack, the burned floor, the tire tracks, all of it whispering a story that felt too close to his own. He rubbed his thumb over the image and muttered, "Whoever you were, you raised one loyal pup." The sun sank lower, washing the fields in amber. Langston gathered his things, carried the dog inside, and filled a chipped bowl with water. Hollow drank greedily, then lay on an old blanket near the stove. For the first time in years, the small cabin didn't feel empty. The ticking of the wall clock, the rustle of Hollow's breathing, even the hum of the fridge formed a rhythm that steadied him. He sat at the table, poured a small measure of whiskey into a cup, and stared out the window into the darkening woods. He could still see in his mind's eye that shack waiting quietly beneath the pines. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was memory. He'd built walls his whole life trying to shut the past out. But that little dog had walked right through them. By midnight, the house was silent, except for Hollow's faint snores. Langston turned off the lamp and sank into the couch, his body tired, but his mind restless. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the roof. He drifted towards sleep, half lost in the rhythm of it, when Hollow jerked upright with a sudden growl. Langston's eyes snapped open. "Hey," he said, voice rough. "What's wrong?" The dog was facing the window, body tense, fur bristling. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, Langston saw its reflection in the glass. Not Hollow's, but something else behind him. A faint silhouette that vanished when thunder rolled through. He jumped up, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the wind shaking the trees. Hollow barked once, then twice the sound, sharp and desperate. Langston crouched down, placing a hand on the dog's back. "Ain't nobody out there," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Hollow trembled under his touch, eyes fixed on the window. The storm outside grew stronger rain, slashing sideways across the panes. Langston turned on the light, scanned the yard, nothing but pine shadows bending in the wind. He closed the curtains, sat back on the floor, and waited until Hollow's breathing steadied again. When the dog finally lay down exhausted, Langston didn't move for a long time. He knew that kind of fear. It was the kind that came from remembering something you couldn't change. He reached for the photo again, still on the coffee table, and whispered, "He still misses you, whoever you are." Hollow stirred ears twitching at the sound of his voice, then drifted back into uneasy sleep. Langston stayed there until dawn painted the curtains gold. When he finally stood and opened the door to let the morning in the air felt thick with humidity and pine, he stepped outside, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulders. That's when he saw the print's small, muddy paw marks circling the truck. He frowned. He had locked the door last night. Hollow had been inside the whole time, yet the tracks were fresh, still damp from the rain. They went around the vehicle twice, stopping by the driver's side door, as if the animal had hesitated before leaving. Langston turned toward the cabin where Hollow now sat in the doorway, head tilted, watching him. "You been out here?" he asked, but the dog only blinked. The marks were smaller than his, maybe lighter, as if belonging to something that didn't quite touch the ground. Langston crouched, touching the print with his fingers. The dirt was cool, the shape delicate. He didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something about the pattern that made his stomach tighten. Hollow whined softly, then trotted over and pressed against his leg. Langston stood slowly looking toward the woods. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called sharp and lonely. "You dreaming of her, huh?" he murmured, trying to find her even now. Hollow's tail flicked once a silent answer. Langston let out a long breath and shook his head. "Guess we both got ghosts, don't we?" He led the dog back inside, fed it from a can of beans he'd been saving, and sat beside the stove again. He told himself that once he found out what happened to that woman, maybe they'd both stop feeling haunted. The thought stayed with him all day. He drove into town, stopped by the sheriff's office, and asked quietly if there had been any recent accidents near the woods off Highway 19. The deputy frowned, thumbed through a stack of reports, then nodded. "Couple months back," he said. "Single vehicle crash, female driver mid-20s. Car went into the river bend after a storm. Never found her body." Langston didn't say anything. He thanked the man, drove home in silence, and sat for a long time in his driveway. By the next sunrise, Langston could no longer ignore the pull of what he had found. The photo, the burned wood, the words back soon scratched in ink. They lingered like the echo of a story, begging to be finished. Hollow stayed close as he packed his truck tail low, as if it understood that something heavy waited ahead. Langston tucked the picture of the young woman into his jacket pocket next to the metal tag that said, "Wait here," and told himself this was just curiosity, not concern. But he knew better. He had buried curiosity years ago under work and silence, and yet here it was again, digging itself out through the bark of a lost dog. The road into town was quiet, lined with crooked mailboxes and uncut grass that waved like forgotten promises. At the diner, old men in baseball caps stared at him as he walked, in the way they often did when someone new or someone different entered their morning rituals. Langston ordered black coffee, kept to himself, and after a few minutes asked if anyone knew of a woman named Ellie who used to live near the Pines off Highway 19. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, froze for a heartbeat before setting down his cup. "You mean Ellie Ward?" she asked softly. Langston nodded. "Heard of her. Why?" The waitress hesitated, lowering her voice. "She went missing 3 months back. Car accident down by the river curve. They said she was driving home after the storm. Sheriff's men never found her body, just her dog running circles near the wreck." The words hit Langston like cold water. He leaned back, jaw tightening. "Her dog?" She nodded. "Yeah, a little black one. Folks said it wouldn't leave the site for days. Someone tried to catch it, but it kept running off. Guess it finally wandered into them woods." Langston felt his throat go dry. He thanked her left money on the table and stepped outside before the air inside could choke him. Hollow sat in the truck bed, ears perked, eyes bright. "That's her, ain't it?" he whispered. The dog tilted its head tail, giving one uncertain wag. Langston started the engine and drove south toward the river gravel, spitting under the tires. The closer he got, the quieter the world became. The bridge loomed ahead, the guardrails bent and rusted, and at the bottom of the slope lay a shallow bend of water that caught the sunlight like cracked glass. He pulled over, cut the engine, and listened. No sound except the trickle of the current and the low hum of summer insects. Hollow jumped down before Langston could stop it padding through the mud toward a patch of flattened grass near the trees. Langston followed the smell of wet soil thick in the air. He saw the broken branches, the faint groove of a skid mark disappearing into the riverbank, and the gray remains of what must have been a burned candle half buried in the dirt. Someone had left it there long ago. Maybe the sheriff, maybe someone grieving. Hollow sniffed the ground tail stiff, then began digging furiously. Easy Langston murmured, crouching beside him. After a few seconds, something soft and white appeared under the mud, a piece of fabric. Langston pulled it free, heart pounding. It was a scarf embroidered with a single name in faded thread, Ellie. Hollow whimpered, pressing its nose to the cloth. Langston closed his eyes, a deep ache blooming behind his ribs. "So this is where you've been waiting," he said. The dog let out a low, mournful sound that didn't sound like any bark he'd heard before. It was grief, pure and simple. Langston folded the scarf carefully and tucked it beside the photograph. The two pieces fit together like pages of the same unfinished story. He stood there for a long while, the heat pressing down the river, whispering against its stones. He could picture it now. The storm, the spin of tires, the sharp flash of water. Maybe Ellie had tried to save Hollow. Maybe the car had gone under too fast. He didn't need every detail to know the truth the little dog had been left with, an order it couldn't disobey. Wait here. That was what she had said before she disappeared. Langston looked down at the pup sitting in the mud, watching the river as if waiting for her to rise from it. He swallowed hard, voice breaking, as he said, "You kept your word longer than anyone could have asked." The dog leaned against his leg, eyes soft, and for the first time, Langston didn't push it away. He lifted Hollow into the truck bed again, took one last look at the water, and whispered, "You can stop waiting now." The drive home was slow quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't hurt, but hums deep like respect. Back at the cabin, Langston cleaned the scarf washed Hollow's paws and placed the cloth, the tag, and the photograph together on the table. It felt wrong to separate them. The more he looked, the more the girl's face in the picture felt familiar, not from memory, but from understanding. She was the kind of person who stopped for things the world ignored. Maybe that's why fate had handed her dog to him, another soul that never quite fit anywhere. That night, as he sat by the window, watching lightning crawl along the horizon, Hollow curled beside him. The air smelled of rain again, the same scent that must have carried Ellie's last breath. Langston spoke softly, almost to himself. Maybe she ain't gone. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving behind a morning so still that every sound seemed sacred. The trees dripped quietly, the air heavy with mist that hovered just above the ground. Langston stood by the truck, staring out toward the bend in the river where Ellie Ward's life had ended. Hollow sat beside him, tail brushing the wet grass, watching the same horizon. Langston had not planned to come back so soon, but sleep hadn't come easy. The more he tried to rest, the more the sound of rushing water filled his ears, as if the river itself was whispering something unfinished. He grabbed his jacket, tucked Ellie's photograph and scarf into his pocket, and drove before dawn. Now standing there with Hollow, he felt that familiar ache rise again, the ache of seeing something both alive and lost at the same time. "All right," he murmured, rubbing the dog's head. "One last look, then we go home for real." Hollow barked once a soft, short sound and trotted down the slope. The mud was slick, swallowing Langston's boots as he followed. The water shimmered in slow silver ripples, and the smell of silt and moss filled the air. Hollow stopped at the edge of the bank, nose twitching. It began to paw at the dirt again, just like before, but this time it didn't dig wildly. It worked carefully, as if it already knew where to look. Langston crouched beside it, brushing aside clumps of mud, and felt his fingers touch something cold. He pulled gently until a small metal chain came free. It was a bracelet, thin, tarnished, but still intact. The charm attached to it was shaped like a heart. The engraving, faint but legible E.W. Langston, froze. The initials hit him like a name spoken in prayer. Ellie Ward, he whispered. Hollow stared at the bracelet, then pressed its nose to his hand. The gesture was so deliberate, so heartbreakingly aware that Langston had to look away for a second. The dog nudged his wrist again, urging him to take it. "You kept this here, didn't you?" Langston said quietly. He rinsed the bracelet in the river until it shone faintly in the morning light. The water ran clear around it as if trying to wash away everything that came before. Hollow whined softly, pawing at his boot, then took the bracelet gently between its teeth and carried it a few feet up the bank before dropping it beside the scarf and photo Langston had laid down earlier. The dog sat beside the items, chest puffed out, tail still. Langston stared, heart twisting at the sight. "You're giving her back to me," he murmured. "Or maybe to yourself." He crouched down, picked up the bracelet, and ran his thumb over the letters. It wasn't just metal, it was proof, the kind of truth that anchored stories to the real world. Ellie had been here. She had loved this dog enough that even death hadn't loosened its hold. Langston sat down in the mud leg stretched towards the water, the cold soaking through his jeans. He didn't care. The river murmured, carrying its endless song downstream. He thought about how she must have looked that night, hands on the wheel headlights cutting through rain. Maybe a hollow barking from the passenger seat. Maybe music still playing low. Then the spin, the flash, the silence. "You waited," he said to the dog, "all this time." Hollow leaned its head on his knee, eyes half closed, as if accepting the words as truth. Langston looked up at the gray sky, his reflection rippling faintly in the water. He hadn't prayed in years, not since his mother's funeral, not since the night he realized some things didn't get fixed no matter how long you begged. But now, in the hush of that riverbank, he whispered something that wasn't quite a prayer, but close enough. "If she's out there somewhere," he said softly, "I'll tell her you never gave up." He looped the bracelet loosely around Hollow's collar, the charm resting against the metal tag that read, "Wait here." The two pieces clinked together, small but certain, and Langston smiled for the first time in days. "Guess you're not just waiting anymore," he said. The wind rose slightly, lifting the edges of the scarf that lay beside the photo. The air smelled cleaner now, the kind of freshness that follows storms when the world feels new again. Langston gathered the scarf, the bracelet, and the picture, wrapping them carefully in a piece of cloth he tore from his own shirt. He tucked the bundle back into his pocket, then stood. The dog stayed seated, watching him with that same unwavering gaze. "Come on," he said gently. "We'll find a better place for her." He started up the slope, boots squelching, and Hollow followed, pausing once to look back at the river. The current glinted under the morning sun, endless and calm, as if carrying her memory gently downstream. When they reached the truck, Langston turned one last time, his chest tightening. The place didn't feel cursed anymore. It felt finished. On the drive home, the road shimmered with light. Hollow rested its head on his arm, and for the first time, Langston didn't flinch at the touch. He let it stay there, the small warmth grounding him. Somewhere along the way, he caught himself humming a tune his mother used to sing, a melody about coming home after a long journey. It felt strange on his lips, like something he hadn't earned, but was learning to again. Back at the cabin, he placed the bracelet on the shelf beside the photo and scarf. The following morning dawned cool, and still sunlight slipping gently through the cracks in Langston's blinds. The smell of wet pine and wood smoke drifted in from the yard, mingling with the faint crackle of the stove where a small fire struggled to stay alive. Hollow lay curled near the door paws, twitching in some quiet dream, the faint glint of Ellie Ward's bracelet catching the light every time it moved. Langston sat at the table staring at the charm that rested against his coffee mug. He turned it over between his fingers again and again, feeling the grooves of her initials. Each pass of his thumb smoothed a little more mud away until the metal looked alive again, as though it remembered what it once meant. He took a slow breath. "You waited for her," he said quietly, looking at Hollow. "Guess somebody ought to wait for you now." The words hung there in the air, fragile but true. He reached for a small pocket knife from the drawer, the same one his father had given him decades ago. The blade was old, the handle worn from years of use, but it still cut clean. Setting the bracelet flat on the table, he whispered, "She carved her name here once. I figure it deserves one more line." His hand trembled slightly as he began to etch. The sound was soft but steady metal scratching against memory. When he was done, he blew away the dust, and under the morning light, the letters gleamed clear. "You were waited for." He stared at the phrase, his chest tight. It wasn't poetry, but it was the truth. Ellie had been loved, misremembered, and somehow that little dog had carried that message across months of rain and silence. Now Langston had carved it into something that could last. He reached down and called softly, "Come here, Hollow." The dog lifted its head, blinked sleep from its eyes, and padded over. Langston knelt beside it, the wood floor cool under his knees. "I fixed this up for you," he said, voice low. He attached the bracelet back to the small metal tag that hung from Hollow's collar, the two pieces clinking like a shared heartbeat. "Now it says what she'd tell you if she could." Hollow looked up at him, eyes shining in the soft morning glow, and licked his hand once before curling against his knee. The simple trust of that touch unraveled something deep inside him. He hadn't realized how long it had been since anyone had leaned on him like that. He rubbed the dog's head and whispered, "You were waited for, too, little one. So was I." For the rest of the morning, Langston worked outside, repairing the fence by the edge of the yard, something he'd been meaning to do for months. Hollow followed him everywhere, no longer pausing to stare toward the woods. It ran through puddles nose to the wind, chasing smells that belonged to the living instead of the lost. Each time Langston looked down at it, he saw a little more light in its movements, a little more freedom in its step. It was as if the inscription had lifted both their burdens at once. Around noon, Langston drove into town to pick up supplies. At the general store, he ran into the same waitress from the diner. She glanced down at the dog by his side and smiled softly. "That the pup?" she asked. Langston nodded. "Yeah. Turns out it belonged to that girl Ellie Ward." The woman's expression turned solemn. "Poor thing," she said. "I heard they never found her. It's good you're taking care of him." Langston hesitated, then said, "Maybe it's the other way around." The woman nodded, understanding in her eyes. He paid for a bag of feed and a tin of polish for the bracelet, something that would keep the metal from tarnishing again. As he walked out, the wind caught a flyer on the bulletin board by the door. It was old weathered, the edges curled, but the face was unmistakable. Ellie Ward. Her eyes looked out from the paper with that same light he'd seen in the photo, that same kindness that had reached across time through a dog's loyalty. He reached out, touched the corner of the poster, and whispered, "You were waited for." He didn't take the flyer down. Some things were better left where they could still be found by others. Back home, Langston spent the afternoon fixing small things around the cabin. For once, his mind didn't wander backward. He noticed the little details again, the creak of the porch step, the smell of cedar, the hum of cicadas returning to the trees. Hollow trailed after him, occasionally dropping a stick at his feet and waiting with expectant eyes. When the sun began to set, painting the yard in gold, and Violet, Langston sat on the porch steps whittling at a scrap of wood just to keep his hands busy. Hollow lay nearby, rolling onto its back with a sigh. The collar jingled softly as it moved, and Langston smiled. "You're starting to sound like life again," he said. The dog barked once playful now, and Langston chuckled a deep, honest sound that startled even him. He hadn't laughed like that in years. As night fell, he lit the lantern and sat by the table again, the bracelet catching the glow like a small, steadfast flame. He thought about how strange it was that grief could lead two strangers to the same doorstep. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar to Langston, like music he used to know but hadn't heard in years. The days no longer dragged in silence, and the house once cold and still began to sound like life again. Hollow had become his shadow, padding softly through every room, curling by his feet when he read and waiting by the porch when he worked. The old wounds of the world had not vanished, but they had softened, and that small cabin, once a monument to loneliness, had turned into something resembling home. Each morning, Langston would wake to the faint jingling of Ellie's bracelet as Hollow stretched and shook the sleep from its fur. They'd share breakfast, a quiet ritual of eggs for him and scraps for the dog, followed by a walk through the mist-soaked fields. The air smelled of pine and morning dew, and the sunlight spilled across the grass like slow forgiveness. Langston noticed that Hollow no longer hesitated when the wind blew from the river, no longer flinched when cars rumbled by on the highway. The ghost of fear had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier trust. Langston didn't say it out loud, but each time the dog trotted ahead of him, tail high and confident, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't known in years. It was like watching someone climb out of grief. Sometimes he caught himself thinking about Ellie, wondering who she had been beyond the tragedy that had defined her story. He imagined her laughter, her voice, her kindness, the kind of kindness that could raise a dog capable of such fierce loyalty. He found himself speaking to her at night, not as a ghost, but as a friend he was finally ready to meet. "He's doing good," he would say softly. "You can rest easy now." And though he never expected an answer, the house would settle in the dark, as if listening. One Sunday, Langston drove into town and stopped by a small hardware store to buy paint. He had decided to restore the fence by the front path, the one that had leaned for years without purpose. The owner, an older man with silver hair and a familiar accent, asked, "You fixin' to sell that place?" Langston shook his head. "No, just fixin' to stay." The man nodded knowingly, the way people do when they recognize the weight behind a few simple words. Back home, Hollow watched from the yard as Langston sanded the old boards smooth. Every so often, the dog would run up, grab a brush in its mouth, and dart away like it was part of the work. Langston laughed, chasing after it, his laughter echoing across the pines. He hadn't realized how much the sound of his own joy had been missing until it came back. When evening fell, he sat on the porch steps, wiping paint from his hands, while Hollow lay beside him, eyes half-closed, nose twitching toward the breeze. The sky burned with the last of the daylight streaks of gold and crimson fading into purple. "Looks like she sent us a good one tonight," Langston murmured. The dog wagged its tail, a slow, steady motion of contentment. The nights grew gentler after that. The restless dreams that used to wake Langston in the small hours stopped visiting. He'd still lie awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling, but the silence didn't feel so heavy anymore. Hollow would stir, rise, and curl against him, warm and grounding its heartbeat steady as the ticking clock across the room. It was a rhythm of belonging two lives that had learned to wait and finally to rest. Then one early morning near the end of summer, Hollow woke him before dawn, pawing gently at his arm. Langston grumbled, half asleep, but the dog wouldn't stop. All right," he muttered, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. Hollow trotted to the door, tail wagging, looking back expectantly. Langston followed, still bleary, and stepped outside. The air was cool and crisp, carrying that first hint of autumn. Hollow ran a few steps ahead, stopped at the edge of the yard, and looked east. Langston turned his gaze in the same direction, and froze. The sun was just beginning to rise over the tree line, spilling light across the valley in waves of orange and pink. The mist caught the glow, shimmering like gold dust over the grass. It was so breathtakingly still that Langston felt something catch in his throat. Hollow sat beside him, silent, watching the light climb higher. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Langston whispered, "You brought me out here for this, didn't you?" The dog's ear twitched as if in agreement. The light touched the metal on Hollow's collar, and for a moment the engraved words, "Wait here, and you were waited for," gleamed side by side, reflecting the dawn. Langston knelt down, placed a hand on the dog's head, and said, "Guess that's what we were doing all along. Huh, waiting for the light." Hollow leaned into his touch, letting out a small sigh, the kind that spoke of peace rather than pain. They stayed there until the sun rose fully, the world around them bright and new. When they finally went back inside, Langston made coffee while Hollow dozed by the stove. The air smelled of roasted beans and clean wood, and somewhere in the stillness, Langston felt the quiet truth of it all settle deep inside him. Healing hadn't come in a grand gesture or a miracle. It had come in mornings like this, slow, patient, filled with tiny mercies. That afternoon, he took Ellie's photo from the shelf, polished the glass, and placed it in a wooden frame he had built himself. He set it by the window facing the sunrise so she would always have light. Autumn had deepened by the time Langston decided to take Hollow back to the road where everything had started. The fields had turned the color of rust and honey, and the pine trees along the ridge hummed softly under the touch of the wind. It had been months since that stormy night when a frightened little dog had run itself nearly to death chasing the back of his old truck. And now that same dog sat upright in the passenger seat, sturdy, alert, its eyes no longer haunted, but alive with quiet wisdom. Langston glanced over at it and smiled. "You ready to see where it all began?" he asked, his voice low and fond. Hollow tilted its head tail, flicking once against the seat, and let out a small breath that sounded like a sigh of understanding. Langston started the engine, and the truck rumbled to life, the sound familiar but steadier now. The road ahead wound like a long scar across the land lined with memories he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But something inside him said it was time. The drive was slow, deliberate. Every turn of the wheels brought back fragments of that first day, the blur of motion, the dust cloud behind him, the way he had told himself not to care. He remembered the look in Hollow's eyes when it had crawled toward his boots, the faint tremble of its body when he picked it up, and how something inside him had cracked open after years of silence. That road had been the beginning of everything he hadn't known he needed. The horizon stretched wide, gold sunlight spilling over it in quiet brilliance. Hollow watched through the windshield nose, twitching at the sense of harvest and wind. Langston thought about how far they had both come from that day, from the ache of waiting and the weight of grief. He had repaired the fences around his land, built shelves for books, and planted a small garden out back. Each act had been a piece of healing, a step away from the loneliness that used to fill every corner of his life. Hollow had changed too. It no longer hid from thunder or flinched at sudden sounds. It had learned to sleep without keeping one ear lifted, to trust the door would open in the morning, to believe that love wasn't something that disappeared in storms. Langston looked at the road ahead and murmured, "You done good, buddy. Real good." The dog turned its head eyes soft and clear, as if understanding every word. The old highway appeared at last, the same strip of red dirt and cracked asphalt where the story had begun. Langston slowed the truck and pulled over near the shoulder, where tall grass bent in the breeze. He shut off the engine. The world grew still except for the gentle sound of cicadas and the rustle of leaves. Hollow lifted its head, watching curiously. Langston opened the door and stepped out, breathing in the air that smelled of dust and memory. The sunlight was brighter now, kinder than it had been that day. "Well," he said softly, "this is it." Hollow jumped down beside him, landing gracefully, tail wagging in a slow rhythm. Together they walked toward the exact spot where Langston remembered stopping the truck, the place where a choice he hadn't planned to make had changed everything. The ground there was bare, the soil darker from years of rain. Langston crouched, dragging his fingers through the dirt, feeling the warmth of it under his skin. "This is where I met you," he said. "Didn't even mean to stop, but I guess fate don't wait for folks to mean things." Hollow sniffed the ground nose pressed close, as if it too could still sense the moment that had rewritten both their paths. After a long pause, the dog sat down beside him and looked up, tongue lolling in the heat, calm and content. Langston smiled faintly. "You ain't chasing cars no more, huh?" he murmured. "Guess you figured out the only road worth running is the one that leads home." He stayed there a while, staring at the stretch of road curving into the distance. For the first time, it didn't look lonely. It looked alive with every tire mark, every drifting leaf, every shimmer of light that moved across it. The road wasn't just where they'd met. It was proof that even mistakes could turn into grace. Hollow shifted closer, resting its head against Langston's leg, and the man felt a weightless peace settle through him. The wind rose again, carrying the faint scent of rain, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled across the sky. But Hollow didn't flinch. Instead, it lifted its head, watching the horizon with steady eyes, unafraid. Langston stood slowly, stretching his back. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's take a walk." They moved down the road together, side by side, each step measured and easy. The sun dipped lower, painting everything in orange and copper. Hollow trotted ahead for a moment, then turned back, waiting until Langston caught up. The sight made him laugh quietly. "You're making sure I don't get lost, huh?" he said. The dog barked once, a low, happy sound that echoed across the quiet stretch of land. When they reached the bend where the fields met the trees, Langston stopped and looked around. The world was silent but full. The grass swayed in long waves and the air shimmered with warmth. He knelt once more, pressing his palm flat against the ground. "You waited here," he whispered, "and now we came back together." He took the small knife from his pocket, the same one he had used to carve Ellie's words, and etched something small into the base of a wooden post near the road. The carving was simple, 2 lines intersecting, forming the shape of a cross with the letters EW beneath it. When he was done, he traced it with his thumb and said, "Now she's got a marker right here where life kept moving." Hollow stood quietly beside him, tail still, ears perked, as if guarding the memory. Langston looked down at the dog and smiled. "She'd be proud of you." Winter came slow that year, soft and golden, the kind of winter that whispered rather than howled. Frost kissed the porch rails each morning, and the air smelled of pine smoke and quiet. Langston stood by the window of his cabin, watching Hollow chase birds across the yard, tail swinging with joy. The bracelet on the dog's collar glinted faintly in the sunlight. The engraved words, "Wait here," and "You were waited for," still clear, despite the months gone by. The world felt lighter now, steadier, filled with a rhythm that made sense again. Since the day they had returned to that Alabama road, Langston had not felt lost. The silence of grief had been replaced by the sound of life paws against wood floors, laughter he never thought he'd hear again, and the low hum of purpose rising from his bones. Hollow had taught him something that work and prayer never had, that love did not need to be grand to be eternal. It only needed to stay. That truth became the seed of something larger. A month after their trip, Langston began visiting the animal shelter in town, helping mend fences and fix cages. He wasn't good with people, but the dogs didn't care about his silences. They only cared that he showed up. Soon word spread that the quiet man who lived by the pines could be trusted to care for strays no one else wanted. By spring, a small group of neighbors had joined him, and together they built an open yard with a simple wooden sign nailed above the gate, "Wait here." Langston had painted the letters himself, using the same shade of blue as his old truck. It wasn't much, just a few kennels, a fenced yard, and a bench under a pine tree, but it became a haven for the forgotten. Every time a new dog arrived, Hollow would greet it, first tail wagging, showing it that waiting could end in love. Some dogs stayed for days, others for months, and each time one found a new home, Langston would smile quietly and whisper, "You were waited for." The town began to change its view of the man by the woods. Strangers who had once looked through him now stopped to talk, to ask about the dogs, to bring supplies. Children came on weekends to help feed or walk them, their laughter filling the air like a hymn. Langston didn't seek recognition, but people found warmth in the way he lived, a man who'd lost everything yet still chose to give. He never talked much about Ellie or how he'd found Hollow, but those who knew his story spoke of it softly, as if it were a prayer you didn't say too loud. And in time, Wait Here became more than a rescue. It became a message, a reminder that kindness once set in motion could outlive the hands that started it. One late afternoon, nearly a year after that first meeting on the road, Langston sat on his porch, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a small heart. Hollow dozed beside him, muzzle gray now from age. The sun was low, the sky bruised with the colors of evening, when he heard a car crunch along the gravel path. Visitors were rare this far out, but Langston didn't move. The car stopped, and after a moment, an elderly woman stepped out, bundled in a coat, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a scarf. Her eyes searched the yard before finding him. "You must be Mr. Meyer," she said softly. Her voice trembled like memory. Langston nodded. "Ma'am," he replied. She looked around, spotting Hollow by his feet. Her breath caught. "That dog," she whispered. That's Ellie's dog." Langston's chest tightened. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "He found me a while back." The woman stepped forward, tears filling her eyes. "I'm her mother," she said. "I read about your rescue in the paper. When I saw the picture, I just knew." Langston couldn't find words. Hollow lifted its head, staring at the woman for a long, still moment before rising to its feet. Then without hesitation, it bounded toward her tail, wagging wildly, barking with a joy that shook the air. The woman dropped to her knees, arms open, and Hollow buried its face against her chest, whining softly. She laughed through her tears, clutching it close. Langston stood silently on the porch, his throat thick. He watched the way Hollow leaned into her, as if recognizing a piece of home it had lost long ago. The sight carved something into him, a realization both tender and vast. This was what love did. It found its way back no matter how long the road. The woman looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping part of her alive." Langston swallowed hard and shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said. "He's the one who kept me alive." She smiled the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and peace. Ellie loved this dog more than anything, she said. I used to tell her that loyalty like his could teach people a thing or two. Looks like I was right. Hollow wagged its tail, pressing closer to her. Langston stepped down from the porch, hands in his pockets, and looked toward the fading sky. The air was crisp, and the last light of day painted the cabin in gold. "You're welcome to come by anytime," he said. "This place, it's hers too, in a way." The woman nodded, still holding the dog. "I think she'd like that." They stood there a while, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The world felt still, the moment suspended between endings and beginnings. Eventually, the woman returned to her car, Hollow sitting by her side until she was gone, then trotting back to Langston's heel. The man smiled down at it. "Guess you needed that," he said. The dog looked up, eyes calm, tail sweeping the ground. Together, they sat on the porch until the stars came out, the world humming softly around them. Langston leaned back, listening to the crickets, the wind, and the faint chime of the bracelet when Hollow moved. He thought of Ellie, of the mother who still loved her, of all the strays now sleeping safely behind the fence he'd built. He realized that none of it had been for nothing. The pain, the waiting, the loss, it had all led here to a small cabin in the pines where kindness had taken root and refused to die. He whispered into the night. We did good, didn't we? Hollow gave a soft bark, curling at his feet, the metal tag shining faintly in the starlight. Langston smiled, a quiet joy blooming inside him. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was waiting for anything at all. The end. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness never dies. Tell me in the comments what moment hit you the hardest, and where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Langston and Hollow's journey.